Chapter 1, Part 8 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 1, Part 8. The expansion of the Greeks over the Aegean islands and the plantation of Greek settlements along the western coast of Asia Minor began when the heroic age was drawing to a close, and continued for about a century and a half. This movement was promoted, and in some of its stages directly caused by the consequences of the Dorian invasion and the migrations in northern Greece. But it may have begun without any external pressure, perhaps on account of overpopulation, and partly in a spirit of enterprise which was tempted by the fertile river valleys and plains of the Asiatic coast, where there was now no great power to oppose them. The Hittite Empire had fallen back from the west, which it was never to reach again. It does not appear even on the distant horizon in the Homeric poems. Apart from the early settlements in the island of Rhodes, which were previous to the Trojan War, the first Greeks who sailed across the Aegean to find new homes were the Achaeans and their fellows from the hills and plains of Thessaly and the plain of the Spercheius. Their expeditions probably started from the landlocked bay of Pagasae, and tradition long afterwards associated the first sea ventures of the Greeks with the port of Iavolcos. Along with the Achaeans there sailed as comrades and allies the Aeolians. Some, indeed, believe that Aeolian was simply another name for Achaean. But it seems safer to regard the Aeolians as distinct from, though closely related to, the Achaeans. It is impossible to determine whether those who crossed the Aegean were settlers in Thessaly, and not rather some of the Aeolians who lived beyond the mountains by another seaboard on the northern shore of the Corinthian Gulf. We know that in early times these Aeolians were engaged in constant warfare with the Aetolians, who ultimately won the upper hand and gave their name to the whole country. And perhaps the pressure of these foes induced some of them to throw in their lot with the Achaeans, who were sailing in search of new homes beyond the sea. It was to the northern part of Asia Minor, the island of Lesbos and the opposite shores, that the Achaean and Aeolian adventurers steered their ships. Here they planted the first Hellenic settlements on Asiatic soil, the beginning of a movement which, before 1,000 years had passed away, was to carry Greek conquerors to the Indian Ocean. The coastlands of western Asia Minor are, like Greece itself, suitable for the habitations of a seafaring people. A series of river valleys are divided by mountain chains which run out into promontories so as to form deep bays, and the promontories are continued in islands. The valleys of the Hermus and the Caicus are bounded on the north by a chain of hills which run out into Lesbos. The valley of the Hermus is parted from that of the Caister by mountains which are prolonged in Chios, and the valley of the Caister is separated from the valley of the Meander by a chain which terminates in Samos. South of the Meander valley there are bays and islands, but the mountains of the mainland are broken by no rivers. The Greek occupation of the lower waters of the Hermus and Caicus is known to us only by its result. The invaders won the coastlands from the Mysian natives, and seized a number of strong places which they could defend: Pitana, Marina, Sima, Ege, Old Smyrna. They pressed up the rivers, and on the Hermus they founded Magnesia under Mount Sipylus. All this, needless to say, was not done at once. It must have been a work of many years, and of successive expeditions from the mother country. The Achaean wave of emigration was succeeded by another wave, flowing mainly from the coasts of Attica and Argolis, and new settlements were planted south of the elder Achaean settlements. The two-pronged peninsula between the Hermus and the Caister rivers, with the off-lying isle of Chios, the valleys of the Caister and Meander, with Samos and the peninsula south of Mount Latmos, were studded with communities which came to form a group distinct from the older group in the north. each group of settlements came to be called by a collective name. As the Achaeans were the most illustrious of the settlers in the north, one might expect to find the northern group known as Achaean. But it is not thus that names are given in primitive times. A number of cities or settlements, which have no political union, and are merely associated together by belonging to the same race and speaking the same tongue, do not generally choose themselves a common name. It rather happens that when they get a common name, it is given to them by strangers who, looking from the outside, regard them as a group, and do not think of the differences of which they are themselves more vividly conscious. And it constantly happens that the name of one member of the group is, by some accident, picked out and applied to the whole. Thus it befell that the Aeolian and not the Achaean name was selected to designate the northern division of the Greek settlements in Asia, just as our own country came to be called not Saxony, but England. The southern and larger group of colonies received the name of Iavones, or Iones, as they called themselves, when they lost the letter V. The Iavones were a people who had settled on the coasts of Argolis and Attica, but there the name fell out of use, and perhaps passed out of memory, until on Asiatic soil it attained celebrity and re-echoed with glory to their old homes. But it would probably be a mistake to regard these two groups as well defined from the first. To begin with, it is possible that they overlapped chronologically. The latest of the Aeolian settlements may have been founded subsequently to the earliest of the Ionian. In the second place, the original homes of the settlers overlapped. Though the Aeolian colonies mainly came from the lands north of Mount Ida, apart from those who came from Aetolia, they included some settlers from the coasts of Boeotia and Euboea. Thus Sima, in Aeolus, derived its name from Euboean Sima, and, on the other hand, though the Ionian colonies were chiefly derived from the coasts of Attica and Argolis, apart from some contingents from Crete and other places in the south, there were also some settlers from the north. Thirdly, the two groups ran into each other geographically. Phocaea, for example, which is geographically in Aeolus, standing on the promontory north of the Hermus River, was included in Ionia. Its name shows that some of the men who colonized it were Phocians, and some of the places in North Ionia, Teos, for instance, had received Achaean settlements first, and were then resettled by Ionians. In Chios, which was afterwards fully in Ionia, a language of Aeolic complexion was once spoken. Of the foundation of the famous colonies of Ionia, of the order in which they were founded, and of the relations of the settlers with the Lydian natives, we know as little as of the settlements of the Achaeans. Clazomene and Teos arose on the north and south sides of the neck of the peninsula which runs out to meet Chios, and Chios, on the east coast of her island, faces Erythrae on the mainland, Erythrae, the crimson, so called from its purple fisheries, the resort of Tyrian traders. Lepidus and Colophon lie on the coast as it retires eastward from Teos to reach the mouth of the Cayster, and there was founded Ephesus, the city of Artemis. By the streams of the Cayster was a plain called the Asian Meadow, which destiny in some odd way selected to bestow a name upon one of the continents of the earth. South of Ephesus, and on the northern slope of Mount Mycale, was the religious gathering place of the Ionians, the temple of the Heliconian Poseidon, which, when once the Ionians became conscious of themselves as a sort of nation, and learned to glory in their common name, served to foster a sense of unity among all their cities from Phocaea in the north to Miletus in the south. Samos faces Mount Mycale, and the worship of Hera, which was the religious feature of Samos, is thought to point to men of Argos as participators in its original foundation. South of Mycale, the cities of Myus and Priena were planted on the Maeander. Then the coast retires to skirt Mount Latmos, and breaks forward again to form the promontory, at the northern point of which was Miletus with its once splendid harbour. There was one great inland city, Magnesia on the Maeander, which must not be confused with the inland Aeolian city, Magnesia on the Hermus. Though counted to Ionia, it was not of Ionian origin, for it was founded by the Magnetes of Thessaly, and settlers from Euboea and Boeotia took part in the colonization of Ionia, as well as the Ionians of Argolis and Attica. The old inhabitants, Leleges, Maeonians, Carians, probably offered no prolonged resistance to the invaders. The old inhabitants, Leleges, Maeonians, Carians, probably offered no prolonged resistance to the invaders, and in some places, as the Carians, for example, at Miletus, they mixed with the Greek strangers. The colonists carried with them into the new Greece beyond the seas traditions of the old civilization which, in the mother country, was being overwhelmed by the Dorian invaders. And those traditions helped produce the luxurious Ionian civilization which meets us some centuries later, when we come into the clearer light of recorded history. And they carried with them their minstrelsy, their lays of Troy, celebrating the deeds of Achilles and Agamemnon and Odysseus. The epic poetry of Greece entered upon a new period in Ionia. It was perhaps in the 9th century that the Iliad as we know it came into being. A poet of supreme genius arose, and it may be that he was the singer whose name was actually Homer. This famous name has the humble meaning of hostage, and we may fancy, if we care, that the poet was carried off in his youth as a hostage in some local strife. He composed his poetry in rugged Chios, and he gives us a local touch when he describes the sun as rising over the sea. From him the Homerid family of the bards of Chios were sprung. He took as his main argument the older poem of the Wrath of Achilles, and expanded it into the shape and compass of the greater part of the Iliad, including one of the noblest episodes in the whole epic, Priam's ransoming of Hector. Tradition made Homer the author of both the great epics, the Odyssey as well as the Iliad. This is not probable, but no great length of time need separate the composition of the two poems. Homer did not give to the Iliad the exact shape in which it was ultimately transmitted, for it received from his successors in the art some additions and extensions which were not entirely to its advantage. He was no mere stringer together of ancient lays. He took the motives, he caught the spirit of the older poems. He wove them into the fabric of his own composition. But he was himself as divinely inspired as any of the elder minstrels, and he was the father of epic poetry in the sense in which we distinguish an epic poem with a large argument from a short heroic lay. His work was thoroughly artificial, conscious art, as the greatest poetry always is, and it is probable that he committed the Iliad to writing. As he and his successors sang in Ionia, at the courts of Ionian princes, he dealt freely with the dialect of the old Achaean poems. The Iliad was arrayed in Ionic dress, and ultimately became so identified with Ionia that the Achaean origin of the older poetry was forgotten. The transformation was not, indeed, perfect, for sometimes the Ionian forms did not suit the metre, and the Aeolian forms were used. But the change was accomplished with wonderful skill. It is probable that the Ionian poet also did much to adapt the epic material which he used to the taste and moral ideas of a more refined age. The Iliad is notably free from the features of crude savagery which generally mark the early literature of primitive peoples. Only a few slight traces remain to show that there was in the background ugly and barbarous things over which a veil has been drawn. In other respects, the Ionian poets have faithfully preserved the atmosphere of the past ages of which they sung. They preserved its manners, its environment, its geography. Only an occasional anachronism slips in, which in the otherwise consistent picture can easily be detected. Unwittingly, for instance, the poet of the Odyssey allows it to escape that he lived in the Iron Age, for such a proverb as, "The mere gleam of iron lures a man to strife," could not have arisen until iron weapons had long been in use. But he is at pains to preserve the weapons and gear of the Bronze Age. Homer preserved the memory of the Trojan War as a great national enterprise. The Iliad was regarded as something of far greater significance than an Ionian poem. It was accepted as a national epic, and was, from the first, a powerful influence in promoting among the Greeks community of feeling and tendencies toward national unity. For 200 years after its birth, the Iliad went on gathering editions, and the bards were not unready to make insertions in order to satisfy the pride of the princely and noble families at whose courts they sang. The Odyssey, affiliated as it was to the Trojan legend, became a national epic too, and the interest awakened in Greece by the idea of the Trojan War was displayed by the composition of a series of epic poems, dealing with those events of the siege which happened both before and after the events described in the Iliad, and with the subsequent history of some of the Greek heroes. These poems were anonymous, and passed under the name of Homer. Along with the Iliad and Odyssey, they formed a chronological series which came to be known as the epic cycle. The Ionic settlements did not complete the Greek colonizations of Asia Minor. The Dorian conquest of the eastern Peloponnesus was followed by a Dorian expansion beyond the seas and a colonization of the Asiatic coast, to the south of Ionia. The Carians had spread over this region down to the border of Lycia, and had pressed the older inhabitants into the promontory which faces the island of Columna. Here the Leleges participated in the latest stages of the Aegean civilization, as we know by the pottery and other things which have been discovered at Termera in chamber tombs. These round tombs, not hewn out of the earth, like the vaulted sepulchres of Mycenae, but built above ground, are found in many parts of the peninsula, and remain as the most striking memorial of the Leleges. The bold promontories below Miletus, the islands of Kos and Rhodes, were occupied by colonists from Argolis, Laconia, Corinth, and Crete. On the mainland, Halicarnassus was the most important Dorian settlement, but it was formed in concert with the Carian natives, and was half Carian. This new Doris eclipsed in fame, and shed a new lustre on the old Doris under Mount Ada. All the settlements were independent, but they kept alive their communion of interest and sentiment by the common worship of the Triopian Apollo. The Carians were a vigorous people. They impressed themselves upon their land, and soon men began to forget that it had not always been Caria. They took to the sea, and formed a maritime power of some strength, so that in later ages a tradition was abroad that there was once upon a time a Carian sea supremacy, though no one could mention anything that it had achieved. The Carians also claim to have made contributions to the art of war by introducing shield handles, and the crested helmet, and the emblazoning of shields, claims which we cannot test. The Greek fringe of western Asia Minor was complete. It was impossible for Doris to creep round the corner and join hands with Pamphylia, for the Lycians presented an insuperable barrier. The Lycians were not a folk of Aryan speech, as a widely spread error supposes them to have been. Their language is related to the Carian. Their proper name was Tremili, but the name Lycian seems to have been given them by others as well as by the Greeks, who recognized in the chief Tremilian deity their own Apollo Lycios. But, though Lycia was not colonized, the Aegean was now entirely within the Greek sphere, excepting only its northern margin, where Greek enterprise in the future was to find a difficult field. It is important to observe that the process by which Asiatic Greece was created differs in character from the Dorian invasion of the Peloponnesus. The settlements of Ionia and Doris are examples of colonization. Bands of settlers went forth from their homes to find new habitations for themselves, but they left a home country behind them. The Dorian movements, on the other hand, partake of the character of folk wandering. The essential fact is that a whole people dispersed to seek new fields and pastures. For the paltry remnant which remained in the sequestered nook beyond Parnassus could not be called the parent people except by courtesy. The people, as a whole, had gone elsewhere. Before the completion of the Greek occupation of the western coast of Asia Minor, another migration left the shores of the Peloponnesus to seek a more distant home. Cyprus, an island whose geographical position marks it out to be contested between 3 continents, was now to receive European settlers. Throughout the Bronze Age it played an important part in supplying the Aegean countries with copper, and it exported timber, but it did not begin to share in the advanced civilization of the Aegean till the very last days of Cnossian supremacy. Then it received colonists from the Aegean, and developed an art which shows the characteristics of Cretan and Mycenaean art, with its own local peculiarities. At Salamis, in the east of the island, sepulchres have been found which show how Aegean culture flourished in Cyprus in the 14th century. The Cypriotes presently learned the craft of manufacturing iron, which was beginning to come into use. Their position, near Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, gave them favourable opportunities for commerce, which brought them wealth. The island was destined, however, to play a part in the world's debate as a wrestling ground between the European and the Asiatic, and the first Europeans who went forth for the struggle were the Peloponnesian Greeks whom, we may suspect, the events of the Dorian invasion incited to wander. Much about the same time, the Phoenicians also began to plant settlements in the island, mainly in the centre, Amathus, Sidon, Idalion, Tamasus, Lapathus, and some places seem to have been colonized jointly by Phoenicians and Greeks, just as on the coast of Asia Minor Greeks and Carians mingled. A new Cypriot culture arose out of the intermingling of the two races and the old inhabitants. The worship of the great mother goddess, attended by doves, was native to Cyprus as to Crete, and the Greeks identified her with Aphrodite, who became universally known as the Cyprian goddess. The settlers in Cyprus spoke the Arcadian dialect, but this does not prove that their old homes were in Arcadia. Before the Dorians came and developed new dialects, the Arcadian speech, with but slight variations, seems to have prevailed in the coastlands as well as in the centre of the peninsula, and some of the Cypriot Greeks went forth from Laconia and Argolis. Some sailed from Salamis in the Attic Bay and gave their name to Salamis in Cyprus. The colonists found already established a mode of linear writing which exhibits close resemblances to the Cretan system, and had probably been imported with the rest of Aegean civilization. This syllabic system was ill adapted to express the Greek language, but the colonists adapted it to their use. And although nothing is clumsier than a Greek writing in the Cypriot character, yet the Greeks of Cyprus clung to it when the rest of their race had learned the use of a finer instrument. If we look back now upon the early history of the Greeks, we see that though we can establish a probable chronology, there is only a single date which can lay claim to precision, and this concerns an event of minor importance, an Achaean raid on Egypt. For all the leading changes and movements we must be content with approximate limits. Greek-speaking peoples occupied Greece. 3rd millennium. Crete, leading power in Aegean. Circa 2200 to 1400 B.C. Advanced Aegean civilization in Greece. From circa 1600 B.C. Fall of Knossos. Circa 1400 B.C. Achaeans invade North Greece. Before 1300 B.C. Achaeans found principalities in Peloponnesus. 1300 to 1250 B.C. Fall of 5th city of Troy. Circa 1250 B.C. Achaeans of Thessaly join in raid on Egypt. 1229 B.C. Trojan War. Early in 12th century. Thessalian conquest. Boeotian conquest, and beginnings of Achaean migration to Asia Minor towards end of 12th century. Ionian colonization in Asia Minor begins, Dorian conquests in Peloponnesus and Crete, Dorian colonization in Asia Minor begins, and Greek colonization of Cyprus, 11th century. Section 9. Fall of Greek monarchies and rise of the republics. Under their kings, the Greeks had conquered the coasts and islands of the Aegean, and had created the city-state. These were the two great contributions of monarchy to Grecian history. In forwarding the change from rural life in scattered thorps to life in cities, the kings were doubtless considering themselves as well as their people. They thought that the change would consolidate their own power by bringing the whole folk directly under their own eyes. But it also brought the king more directly under the eye of his folk. The frailties, incapacities, and misconduct of a weak lord were more noticed in the small compass of a city. He was more generally criticized and judged. City life, too, was less appropriate to the patriarchal character of the Homeric shepherd of the people. Moreover, in a city, those who were ill-pleased with the king's rule were more tempted to murmur together, and able more easily to conspire. Considerations like these may help us to imagine how it came about that throughout the greater part of Greece in the 8th century, the monarchies were declining and disappearing, and republics were taking their place. It is a transformation of which the actual process is hidden from us, and we can only guess at probable causes. But we may be sure that the deepest cause of all was the change to city life. The revolution was general, the infection caught and spread, but the change in different states must have had different occasions, just as it took different shapes. In some cases gross misrule may have led to the violent deposition of a king. In other cases, if the succession to the sceptre devolved upon an infant or a paltry man, the nobles may have taken it upon themselves to abolish the monarchy. In many places perhaps the change was slower. The kings who had already sought to strengthen their authority by the foundation of cities must have sought also to increase or define those vague powers which belonged to an Arian ruler, sought, perhaps, to act of their own free will without due regard to the council's advice. When such attempts at magnifying the royal power went too far, the elders of the council might rise and gainsay the king, and force him to enter into a contract with his people that he would govern constitutionally. Of the existence of such contracts we have evidence. The old monarchy lasted into late times in remote Molosia, and there the king was obliged to take a solemn oath to rule his people according to law. In other cases the rights of the king might be strictly limited, in consequence of his seeking to usurp undue authority, and the imposition of limitations might go on until the office of king, although maintained in name, became in fact a mere magistracy, in a state wherein the real power had passed elsewhere. Of the survival of the monarchy in a limited form we have an example at Sparta. Of its survival as a mere magistracy we have an example at Athens. And it should be observed that the functions of the monarch were already restricted by limits which could easily be contracted further. Though he was the supreme giver of dooms, there might be other heads of clans or tribes in the state who could give dooms and judgment as well as he. Though he was the chief priest, there were other families than his to which certain priesthoods were confined. He was, therefore, not the sole fountain of justice or religion. There is a vivid scene in Homer, which seems to have been painted when kings were seeking to draw tighter the reins of royal power. The poet, who is in sympathy with the kings, draws a comic and odious caricature of the bold Carl with the gift of fluent speech, who criticizes the conduct and policy of the kings. Such an episode could hardly have suggested itself in the old days before city life had begun. Thersites is assuredly a product of the town. Odysseus, who rates and beats him, announces, in another part of the same scene, a maxim which has become as famous as Thersites himself: "The sovereignty of many is not good. Let there be one sovereign, one king." That is a maxim which would win applause for the minstrel in the banquet halls of monarchs who were trying to carry through a policy of centralization at the expense of the chiefs of the tribes. Where the monarchy was abolished, the government passed into the hands of those who had done away with it, the noble families of the state. The distinction of the nobles from the rest of the people is, as we have seen, an ultimate fact with which we have to start. When the nobles assume the government and become the rulers, an aristocratic republic arises. Sometimes the power is won, not by the whole body of the noble clans, but by the clan to which the king belonged. This was the case at Corinth, where the royal family of the Bacchiads became the rulers. In most cases the aristocracy and the whole nobility coincided, but in others, as at Corinth, the aristocracy was only a part of the nobility, and the constitution was an oligarchy of the narrowest form. At this stage of society the men of the noble class were the nerve and sinew of the state. Birth was then the best general test of excellence that could be found, and the rule of the nobles was a true aristocracy, the government of the most excellent. They practised the craft of ruling, they were trained in it, they handed it down from father to son, and though no great men arose, great men are dangerous in an aristocracy, the government was conducted with knowledge and skill. Close aristocracies like the Corinthian were apt to become oppressive, and when the day approached for aristocracies in their turn to give way to new constitutions, there were signs of grievous degeneration. But on the whole the Greek republics flourished in the aristocratic age, and were guided with eminent ability. The rise of the republics is about to take us into a new epoch of history, But it is important to note the continuity of the work which was to be done by the aristocracies with that which was accomplished by the kings. The two great achievements of the aristocratic age are the planting of Greek cities in lands far beyond the limits of the Aegean Sea, and the elaboration of political machinery. The first of these is simply the continuation of the expansion of the Greeks around the Aegean itself. But the new movement of expansion is distinguished, as we shall see, by certain peculiarities in its outward forms, features which were chiefly due to the fact that city life had been introduced before the colonization began. The beginning of colonization belonged to the age of transition, from monarchy to republic. It was systematically promoted by the aristocracies, and it took a systematic shape. The creation of political machinery carried on the work of consolidation, which the kings had begun when they gathered together into cities the loose elements of their states. When royalty was abolished, or put, as we say, into commission, the ruling families of the republic had to substitute magistracies tenable for limited periods, and had to determine how the magistrates were to be appointed, how their functions were to be circumscribed, how the provinces of authority were to be assigned. New machinery had to be created to replace that one of the three parts of the constitution which had disappeared. It may be added that under the aristocracies the idea of law began to take a clearer shape in men's minds, and the traditions which guided usage began to assume the form of laws. In the lays of Homer we hear only of the single dooms given by the kings or judges in particular cases. At the close of the aristocratic period comes the age of the lawgivers, and the aristocracies had prepared the material which the lawgivers improved, qualified, and embodied in codes. End of Chapter 1, Part 9. Recording by Kalinda in Dover, New Hampshire, on July 10th, 2007.